This is Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and thank you for coming to our webinar about the looming COVID-19 medicine shortage. We're going to begin in just a few moments. A few just housekeeping points, which is we've been having some interesting technical difficulties. Everything's going to work, but Rosemary Gibson, the author of the award-winning book China RX, is having computer problems, so she'll be joining us by phone. So you will not be able to see her face, but you'll get to hear all of her insights. And Congresswoman Delauro will be a few minutes late in starting with us because she's gotten called into a leadership meeting that's about to end. So we're going to start with Rosemary, and we're going to start in just a few moments. Here are some other housekeeping things. Please use the chat to ask questions. I originally heard Rosemary speak at an event that Congresswoman Rosa Delauro organized. Her research is fascinating. Her book is really scary and interesting. And it turns out to be very insightful now in that we need to figure out how to have a more resilient supply chain for medicine in the context of this crisis. This crisis has really just revealed problems that were already happening, as Rosemary is going to explain. So think of some good questions and type them into the chat box, and my colleagues will be accumulating them because people may have some of the same questions. And as soon as we get through the Q&A that I'm going to do with our guests, then we will go to your questions. It'll be about half and half. And I think we're basically ready to start. So again, for folks, I see people are jumping on as I speak. Welcome to the webinar on the looming COVID-19 medicine shortage. A lot of people have seen in the news the rising stories about the prospect that the next thing we're going to fall short of is medicines, basic medicines. The sedatives used for people on ventilators, the antibiotics they use for the secondary infections related to the COVID crisis. And as we're going to learn today, basically this crisis has laid bare a problem that's been brewing. There have been shortages along the way already. They've not been as evident. And there's some structural problems for that need to be addressed. So without further ado, I'm going to ask a few questions I suspect everyone has about how the heck it's possible in the richest country in the world we can't make or get the basic medicines that we need to keep our population safe, and that down the road we may literally be facing some real shortages we're going to live with in the same way that the scramble for masks and respirators and ventilators has made us clear how much of our production in those sectors we have basically outsourced using very thin, very brittle supply chains, so that there's so many steps and links along the way that if one piece snaps, you can have a worldwide shortage. And we've seen how, as bad as the virus is, the health and economic outcomes are even worse thanks to this ultra globalized set of supply chains that we now are seeing have no resilience, cannot supply us securely with the things we need. So it's my honor to introduce Rosemary Gibson. She's a journalist, award-winning author. Her book, China RX, I recommend. It's incredibly well researched, both historically and what the present day situation is. It wasn't written now with the COVID crisis, it was written before, but it is really prescient because it explains a lot of the trouble that we're finding ourselves in. So I would like to start with Rosemary, please, setting the scene. So basically, in a broad sense, Rosemary, how have we gotten ourselves into this situation where we could face medicine shortages, and how bad is it really?
Well, Lori, first, it's great to be with you. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me, and welcome, everybody. It's great to be with all of you. I started working on China RX back in 2014 because it took several years to figure out this very complex system. And I'll just give you a few highlights. So today, we can no longer make aspirin. We can't make penicillin. We can't make vitamin C. And so many, the generic antibiotics that you take for bronchitis or strep throat, we can't make them anymore. And if we go do a deep dive on how that happened, it's an incredible story. So I'm going to tell you the story of penicillin because I think a lot of people know, have heard of penicillin. You may have taken it for certain infections. And this is actually data that came from Europe. Europe was much more transparent while trying to understand this system that we have. So there used to, and this is why we have shortages today. So there was a very large penicillin plant. It made the raw material, these giant fermentation plants, and it was in upstate New York, near Syracuse. And it announced in 2004 that it was closing. And this was a plant that used to make 70% of the world's supply of the ingredient to make penicillin. And some very public-spirited people sent me some information on this and their charts and slides. And it shows how in 2004, there were a handful of Chinese companies that the government had done a very wise thing in China. They had invested heavily in building plants. The government paid for that. And a handful of these companies then dumped it, which is a technical trade term. They dumped it. In other words, they sold it at a very low price on the global market.
Sold it below the cost it actually meant to produce it. It's what dumping means. It's a way of
exactly.
To knock out
exactly. Thank you, Lori. And they kept it low for about 4 years. And what they did was they drove out all the last manufacturer in the U.S. They drove out the last plant in India, so India cannot make penicillin, and other plants around the world. And once their competitors were driven out, and you have just a handful of these big plants left, then they raised the price. So there's been a strategy to, if I call it the cartel strategy, the penicillin cartel. The same thing happened with vitamin C. We can't make vitamin C anymore. Again, clear-cut evidence in a federal court case. It was dumped on the global market at below market prices, and all the U.S., European, and even Indian producers, and no doubt others, were driven out. So what happens is you have, for the whole world, a smaller number of manufacturers. And they're concentrated in a single country. So I liken it to having, 80% of the world's oil supply in a single country, or 80% of the wheat or corn that we need to eat coming from a single country. So if you have any disruption with weather, or say an earthquake, or here we are in a global pandemic, there's going to be problems. I'll give you one other example, and there's a really important antibiotic that's used to treat sepsis, which is a really deadly condition if you don't get treated well for it. And there was a single plant in China, again because of this strategy. China's aim is to become the pharmacy to the world. It has an industrial policy to do that, and 5-year plans over subsequent, 5-year periods to demonstrate this plan. And so this single plant went down. It exploded. Chemical factory, if you don't handle them right, then you can have accidents like that. So when this one plant exploded, there was a global shortage. So these are huge plants, and what we have is production concentrate. And what we're talking about here is not the pills we take, but these are the chemicals needed to make them, and sometimes the active ingredients. But China really has a dominant global share of the raw materials and chemicals, the molecules to make our medicines. And so when everything's so centralized, then when things happen, we have shortages.
So I was going to jump in with a question, because so it seems that there are two different phenomenon. One is the phenomena of not having redundant production, and that's a problem because, as you said, then if you have a problem with the sole source, the whole world's out of luck. But it seems also the second issue was sort of competitive strategy by a particular country to have that country's pharmaceutical industry or chemical industry have a global dominant role. How does that relate to the fact I think a lot of us are starting to see in the coverage of this looming shortage about how every hospital has 150 life-saving drugs. They all have the same drug for sure. And that even before the COVID crisis, of those really, really essential drugs, over 60 of them were in shortage on a regular basis. Is that because there's not redundancy? Is that related specifically to a strategy with China? Is that the actual medicines, or is that the ingredients, which everybody, for a bit of jargon, that's not my usual trade jargon. New one is API, Active Pharmaceutical Ingredients. Those are the building blocks of medicines. So when you heard, for instance, that part of this crisis was the generic industry in India provides half of our generic medicines in the US, but they're having a problem. The problem they're having is they can't get the APIs from China. So those generic drugs get made of the stuff that's coming from China, and then the generic drugs come to us. So how does this, 60 of the 150 key drugs before COVID being in shortage, is that the lack of redundancy, or is that a China issue, or what is that, Rosemary?
Let's say you're a company and you're making medicines and you want to sell them in the U.S. and elsewhere, you have a real challenge because with Chinese companies that are subsidized, India is a big generic drug maker, but China has an advantage because its companies are subsidized by its government. It has an industrial policy. So if you and I want to build a manufacturing plant and produce medicine, China's going to come in and undercut everybody on price. So I can't survive. And when you drive out the competition, where's the redundancy going to be?
So and it's connected.
It's what?
It's connected.
Absolutely right. So will China, expand its capacity? But do we really want a single? I've been advocating for diversifying the manufacturing base. And what that's going to take, say if we wanted to have plants here for some really critical drugs and all the ingredients to make them. If you and I want to start a business to make these products, we're going to need a contract, say from the government or a group of hospitals that said, yeah, we're going to guarantee that we're going to pay you for the next 5 years to produce X volume of critical drug. And I think the hospitals need to start doing that because they're relying on these global supply chains that are so fragile. So you can't have redundant capacity if you can't compete in the global marketplace where you have a player that has undercut everybody on price as a deliberate strategy as part of its industrial policy.
So I see that, I've seen the data, 95% of our ibuprofen, 91% of the US supply of hydrocortisone, 90% of acetaminophen, Tylenol effectively, ibuprofen being all the different names that we know for these two pain pills, and hydrocortisone, anti-inflammatory cream, etc. Those are the vast majority made offshore. So how did it get that way? Can you tell us a little bit about when were we making the ingredients and the actual medicines here? When was that was solid, and when did the shift start to happen, and why?
Sure, I'll just add to your list, Lori, because there's thousands of our generic drugs, and I'm talking mostly about our generic drugs, which are 90% of the medicines we take, and those are the ones that are more accessible to people. We can't make any generic antibiotics anymore in the U.S. We can't make the antibiotics for, as I mentioned, sepsis, or last resort antibiotics for like MRSA, or these antibiotic these bugs that are resistant to antibiotics. And it's this began in the 1980s. We were making our own medicines. Companies were vertically integrated. They made the chemical starting materials, way upstream. Then they made the finished drugs. But that began to shift, and it was interesting. In the China RX book, one of the factors was the generic drug law that has made incredible progress for allowing people to have affordable medicines. But companies then wanted to find a cheaper way to make them. And so they outsourced some of the core chemicals. And that started in the 90s and maybe somewhat in the late 80s. And then it was incredible. I was sitting at the desk where I am now, and this light bulb went off. I noticed that once we opened up free trade with China in 2000 with the U.S.-China Trade Act, and China joined the WTO, that happened in 2000 and 2001 respectively. Within 2 years, that's when our last aspirin plant closed. It's when our last vitamin C plant closed. It's when the last penicillin plant closed. And that's when we started, Baxter started buying heparin, raw material from China, that ended up killing hundreds of people, if not more, a couple years later.
Can you explain what happened just very quickly?
Yeah, this is just a tragedy of epic proportions. There's a very common blood thinner that's used in hospitals called heparin, and we used to make it here, all of it, the ingredients and everything. But then China developed industrial capacity to make the raw material, which comes from pigs, and China has had the biggest pig population of the world. It actually comes from pig intestines. And about 12 years ago, there was a disease outbreak that killed a lot of pigs there, so there was a shortage of the raw material. And so very enterprising minds came up with a fake substitute. And it was patented, and it was a highly sophisticated operation that mimicked the real product, and actually it didn't show up in the tests that were typically conducted at the time to test for the, in the finished product. The problem was it was lethal at high doses. And it was sent to the U.S. and around the world, and I think the official FDA numbers were that like 246 people. Their deaths were associated with heparin, but we really don't know, and I think it's a whole lot more. And I open up the story in China RX of a retired Johns Hopkins physician who walked into the Mayo Clinic in Arizona and got contaminated heparin. And his heart began to fail, and he just suffered a terrible 3 months of the last months of his life. So this is a real problem. And of course, the blood pressure medicine that came from an API from a plant in China that had rocket fuel compounds in it, that went to more than 20 countries around the world from a single plant. So here we go. Why do we have shortages? Because we have real concentration. And if you have one problem at one plant, it affects the whole world.
That's a perfect place, actually. Thank you, Rosemary, for us to introduce Congresswoman Rosa Delauro. Congresswoman Rosa Delauro, thank you so much for joining us. I explained to our several hundred participants that you were on a very important meeting, and in a very important meeting call, and I know with congressional leadership, and I know you're going to have to jump back to there, but Congresswoman Delauro has been one of the leaders, champions really in Congress for us being able to have safe and affordable medicine. And she really did a heroic job during the NAFTA renegotiation to make sure that we started to have a new model in our trade agreements that didn't have all the big pharma monopolies and giveaways that promote and make it much cheaper for the companies to go offshore and know that they will basically be able to charge any ludicrous high price. But that improvement in the NAFTA, of course, does not a fix make. And the Congresswoman has been such a incredibly passionate, committed advocate in this area that Congresswoman, if you please could add to the conversation where Rosemary's laid out the problem, no redundancy, a huge concentration in China. Since China entered the WTO, our domestic production has gone into the tank, etc. First of all, thank you so much for finding time. Welcome to the call. And could you give us some of your views, please?
Sure, I am delighted. This is such an important, a very, very, very important conversation. And I'm sorry for my being taken away, but because I really wanted to participate, and I will, and I am now, and I'm grateful to you, Lori, for your wonderful introduction and the work that you've done as Director of Global Trade Watch, public citizen, with such a leading voice on making sure the rules of the road are rules that are working for working people. So we've seen so often that rules are rigged against our workers. So I can't tell you, it's a delight for me to continue to fight side by side with you. You are a fierce advocate, and it's very helpful to me to be able to call on your expertise. I want to recognize Rosemary, and I can't thank you enough. And I had the opportunity earlier this year. You spoke at an event that I hosted about your book, China RX, and that was in my home. But you are a national authority on so many of the health topics. And I'm just going to extend this information now. Come hell or high water, I'm going to figure out a way in which I can do a briefing with you for our subcommittee, Rosemary, and whether we have to do it by phone or whether we can do it in person, I'm going to just sort it out, because what you have to say is so critically important for all of us. Look, I think the pandemic forces us to re-examine the issue of supply chains and the access to goods. Clearly, access to critical medicines demands our scrutiny and our attention. It reflects a trade imbalance, but also this is an issue of national security. If we depended on China for 80% of our food, we would recognize how untenable and potentially dangerous this was. If you think about that. So I don't believe it's a stretch to say that medicine deserves the same kind of emphasis. The statistics are staggering. 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers are located outside of the US. For many of the APIs, for so many of the APIs for the critical drugs, China is the only supplier. It has a near monopoly on the ingredients for hundreds of drugs, including for blood pressure medications, antibiotics, all made in China and only in China. You know, with respect to how this occurred, the answer appears to be that the pharmaceutical companies outsourced their production for the very same reasons that other companies shipped jobs and production overseas, because the rules were rigged to make it cheaper for them. At a hearing in February, I asked Secretary Alex Azar, the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, about moving production back to the United States. And this is what he said: that it would increase costs and make prescription drugs less affordable. Ensuring that Americans can access affordable drugs has got to be a priority for all of us, which is why I support measures like negotiation and competitive licensing. I do not share Secretary Azar's binary view of production, that either these will be made in China or they'll not be affordable. No, I mean, what are we talking about here? We can have affordable drug prices, and we can return manufacturing of APIs to the United States. We can and we must, frankly. Just let me insert here for a second. When I discussed the protective equipment, PPE, with the head of FEMA, what he told me was that less than 10% of PPE is manufactured in the United States. And therefore, we need to scour the world. And 20% of what we're finding is going to FEMA, but 80% is going into a commercial pipeline, so that we have states, localities fighting with one another to get hold of a product that is necessary for people to survive. This is unconscionable that we find ourselves in these positions. So we can and we must be able to manufacture in the United States and have affordable drug prices. You know, it's a Nobel-winning economist, Joe Stiglitz. He's written, and I quote, "Inequality is not inevitable. It is a choice we make." I believe the same is true of this. It is not inevitable that it's cheaper to be manufacturing APIs overseas. Instead, it is the result of intentional policies. special monopoly protections in our trade agreements, special tax breaks, such as what the president and the Republicans have included in their 2017 tax law, which actually incentivizes outsourcing by taxing offshore income at 10%, domestic income at 20%. And it's the result of that race to the bottom that pharmaceutical companies embarked on in order to find the cheapest inputs possible. The APIs that Rosemary speaks about, they did so despite concerns about quality. They did so despite concerns about supply chain and national security, and they were welcomed with open arms from the Chinese government, who were seeking to become the center of medicine production, and they succeeded. So no, not inevitable, but the result of intentional policy choices and business decisions. So then it is not irreversible either. It can be changed, it must be changed. This pandemic is providing a stark reminder of why. We are seeing firsthand that supply chains are only as strong as their weakest link, and that in its current form, the supply chain for APIs and essential medication is not resilient because it has no redundancies to create a new supply. This is an untenable situation, and one that could actually worsen the health consequences and economic damage of this pandemic. So in the Congress, I believe we have to look at what we can do to secure our supply of essential and vulnerable active medical ingredients. And the CARES Act, the third relief package, we directed at least $3.5 billion to BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, to be spent on manufacturing, production, and the purchase of items. That includes, and I quote, and I'm not a scientist, I'm a small molecule active pharmaceutical ingredients. And while this pandemic is ongoing, we need to address the flaws in the supply chain now and look at the policies that really can bring the supply chains home or closer to home and create what we need for the future. Look, I chair the House Appropriations Subcommittee, which funds and oversees HHS and BARDA and the Strategic National Stockpile. So I'm committed to support, including API in the stockpile moving forward. This is not going to be the last pandemic. We need to secure and protect essential goods and medicines that our people will need for today and for tomorrow. We will continue to examine the issue, to review relevant legislation, and I want to work with experts like Rosemary and with public citizen Laurie, so to protect the nation's supply of and access to the crucial medicines that they need and the active ingredients that go into those medicines. I can't say enough about what you're doing here today and how critically important it is. And I thank you for welcoming me here today and actually being a guide and mentors as we go down this road together as we move forward. So thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman Delauro. You've been a great champion, and I feel that the country's more likely to get this problem fixed because you're in Congress. She's genius, and she's tough, and she's relentless, Congresswoman Delauro is. So I know, Congresswoman, that you also need to be keeping an eye on this leadership discussion. So I want to thank you, knowing you may need to go unless you want to stay for a question.
Let me have a question. Let me have a question. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, super. So a whole bunch of people have asked a similar question, which is how could the US go about making or subsidizing or reestablishing manufacturing of APIs and actual medicines? And one thing I would just flag in there for the folks who are asking that question is just yesterday, legislation was introduced in the Senate. It's about to go in the House. Probably the Congresswoman's one of the lead sponsors. Medical Supply Transparency and Delivery Act that basically creates a new executive branch authority to coordinate the powers that exist under the Defense Production Act which gives a lot of authority to do what the Congresswoman just said, which is to put in long-term orders, which is Rosemary said is necessary, but also to actually help invest money into building factories. So Congresswoman, enlighten us, please.
Please, this is, and you know, we have the legislation there. We need to do some things in the short term to move forward. But I think this tells us where our future needs to lie with the manufacturing. And we have to make critical investments, robust investments, and deal with incentives. We can, this is something that we can't do. And for those who have said, you know, you can't put your finger on the scale, you can't do something, you know, for one that you don't, and not for another. I think if anything, what this pandemic has showed us is where the gaps are, where the problems are, and where we have come up short, because what we haven't done is to invest in a substantial way and incentivize manufacturers to deal with the production of this effort. We also need to take a look at our trade agreements, which you know about and which I know about, and to make sure that what we are not doing is allowing for the outsourcing of our abilities, of our production, and begin to reel all of that in and make sure that we are focused on how we can ensure through these agreements that we are not putting ourselves at grave risk when it comes to these efforts. We shouldn't put our fate, whatever it is, into the hands at this point of China, of one country who can pull the rug out, where the rug can be pulled out from us at any moment. That is crazy, and we've got to win that back. And my belief is, you know, the window opens only for a short period of time. What we need to do is to take the madness and the tragedy of this pandemic and find out where those flaws are, where the holes are, and use it as an opportunity for us to be able to move forward. And we need to move, and we need to move quickly on these issues with the best minds that can help us. As I said, and I will quote Stiglitz again, the best minds, the best policy. This is not inevitable. We need to take it back, and I believe we can.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We really appreciate your spending time with us. And you're welcome to stay as long as you want. I know you have to run though, so you've been more than gracious. And thank you very much. And I'm going to...
No, I just said thank you for letting me be a part of this today. I appreciate it.
And I'm going to jump into some of the questions that are coming. Of course, you're welcome to stay, but I know you are now breaking the laws of physics and trying to be in two places at the same time. So if you want to bend the laws of physics back to the other reality, please go ahead, and thank you again. Some more of our questions are about some very specific things that can get done. You got a lot of thumbs up, Congresswoman, for that intervention. Just to lay some framework out, and then if the Congresswoman can stay, or Rosemary, if you could jump in. To me, listening to what Rosemary has said and what the Congresswoman has said, there are at least 4 areas that could make a big difference. So number one is we need the government to actually make some long-term orders. Rosemary said that. That's allowed under the Defense Production Act. It's been used on the regular for other things, like for instance, what are called rare earth minerals, which are needed for guidance systems and military equipment. So the government does a 5-year, 7-year contract to try and create an investment in having mines in places, in this instance, again, other than China. So we need to have the demand that a government contract can do. And related to that sort of sub-note, we need to have more than one provider in the US, or we'll have all the kind of monopoly concentration problems. So we need a couple of suppliers of key pharmaceutical ingredients and medicines domestically through bidding contracts. Seems like number 2, we need to create incentives. That's what the Congresswoman said, incentives. So number 1, we need to get rid of the tax rules that were just put in place that make corporate income earned offshore taxed at a lower rate than the stuff that is domestically earned. That's the backwards incentive. If anything, it should go the other way around if we're trying to get these companies to reinvest here and create some redundancy and resilience in the medicine supply chain. It seems like another important incentive in that regard would be to strengthen the Buy America rules. So since 1933, since the Great Depression, with Roosevelt, FDR did Buy America, Buy American. And the idea was that if the US makes something, better replant our tax dollars into US communities and jobs, and basically have a sort of recyclable, renewable resource of creating jobs and companies that get taxed, that create income, that then buy the stuff that's made here. And there have been a lot of waivers. So there is theoretically in law right now that we shouldn't be buying all of the government supplies of medicine for the Defense Department, for the military, for the VA, et cetera. Shouldn't be offshore, but a bunch of it is. So tightening that up could make a big difference. Of course, slowly phased in so you don't cause a big shock. But if domestic goods actually have a market in the government, that's frequently how we create the things we want. That's how fuel efficiency was created in cars. When the government was buying cars, they required in the 70s a corporate average fuel economy. And that's how they slowly got efficient cars, created the market, and then it became law that that's what had to happen. Seems like another thing's coordination. And that's the new law that's being talked about today, to make sure that stuff is being made when it's needed and distributed when it's needed. And then Rosemary, what am I missing? What else besides obviously the trade agreements? We need to fix that. What else?
Well, Lori, Congresswoman Delauro was talking about cost, and it was said, well, we can't bring it home because it costs too much. I've had the real pleasure of meeting people who actually make prescription drugs. They have years and years of experience, and there's this incredible new manufacturing technology that's out there. And there's a gentleman who got funding from the Gates Foundation to make really important generic drugs for countries in Africa. I think one of the first ones he made was to prevent HIV/AIDS transmission from mother to child, nevirapine. And with this advanced manufacturing technology, he was in really smart chemical way of doing it. He was able to make it at 38% less cost. Because with this new we've been making drugs the same way, for 100 years without any advancement. We can actually make them cheaper, faster, and smaller environmental footprint. The generic companies we talk about generic companies. Mylan is shutting down. It's the last generic company based in Morgantown. It's merging with Pfizer that announced the opening of its global generic headquarters in Shanghai. So we really don't have, we don't have any big generic companies left anymore, or even small, just a handful of small ones. So we have a chance to reinvent and invest in manufacturing of the future to make our medicines cheaper, not the old way.
Well, I was just going to ask you, how much of this is also antitrust problem, where these guys are merging and they buy up the competitors, shut down the production. So where there used to be 3 companies and 3 factories, the big guy gobbles up both of the other ones and shuts them down. It sounds like that is what you're saying is part of the problem.
Well, yes, and that's because, again, how do you compete? If you're making generic drugs in Morgantown, West Virginia, how do you compete with the labor and regulatory and plus cartel behavior and currency manipulation of Chinese companies? You can't. So it's that cartel and antitrust, and we can get into later. We got to deal with this vitamin C cartel case. I won't go into it now, but China wanted to legitimize cartel behavior for products like vitamin C, and they wanted to do the same thing for medicines. So we need a legal strategy. I also wanted to bring something to your attention about what is Buy American. I don't know if you noticed the court case that happened in February, the Federal Appeals Court decision. The VA has had, Buy American or Trade Agreements Act, and the industry brought a case saying, no, it used to be that where the API was made, that was country of origin. So if the API was made in China, the country of origin of the drug was China. But with this federal court case, if the API is made in China, but the finished drug is made here, it's labeled made in the U.S. It's labeled made in the U.S. So we actually watered down with that court case Buy American provisions, but the good news is there's legislation in the Senate, or bills in the Senate, that would say, no, we're going to have Buy American as Buy American. And that would be a good thing. The other wrinkle I would bear in mind is that there's the Chinese company that sold this blood pressure medicine to millions of people around the world, including here, opened up a finished drug facility in North Carolina a couple of years ago. So do they qualify under Buy American? And they've received millions and millions of dollars in subsidies from their government. So we have a lot of work to do, but we need to. I love what Congresswoman Delauro said about we've got to think of our medicines, the critical ones, like we do food. We've got to protect it. We've got to treat it as something that matters, not as a cheap commodity like T-shirts. We've outsourced our medicine making and treated them like T-shirts. This is life-saving product that we need when we need it, and it should be there available for every person every time at an affordable price.
Let me ask you a question that came in from our friend Brett, the AFL-CIO, about, I always say the name wrong, but is it remdesivir? The medicine that yesterday the test came back showing it might be effective against COVID. What is the API for that, and what does the production chain look like for that medicine, given it is maybe part of the solution going forward on the COVID crisis?
My understanding is from a very reliable source. I believe this is correct. It can be verified, but my understanding is that many of the components to make it are sourced in China. And the same is true with hydroxychloroquine. The starting material to make it is sourced in China. And I just want to add, just one of the things, there's so much to learn in this field. One of the things I learned that, active ingredients, what are they made of? They're made of chemicals, chemical molecules. And who controls that market, that production? This is going further upstream in production, basic chemical molecules. China controls the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical chemical industry worldwide. So that's something else we got to bring that home too.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because we have a bunch of people who've come in with questions saying things like, it's not just medicine, it's all of the other supplies, face masks and tests and components of tests. And there are many other industries that are really essential for public health and welfare and well-being, or for that matter, national security, that we have seen largely outsourced in the last 20, 25 years. So it seems like we need a whole new ecosystem of resilience in manufacturing. How do you think that the companies that might be able to produce those components, chemicals, the APIs, and the medicines would be most likely to start up production here? Is it a matter of, another person has asked, a matter of enforcing the trade law so China can't dump that stuff? Is it government orders? Is it stronger Buy American? Is it all of the above? What would get us started in the right direction for this kind of domestic production that we need some piece of? I don't think anyone's calling for autarky, that we're totally self-reliant.
Sure, absolutely.
We sure need a chunk of it. And how does that get started up?
Well, I think you laid out, Lori, very nicely some of those ingredients in our policy. Let's start with where the government procures directly. And they procure directly. The DoD buys medicines. The VA buys medicines. Strategic National Stockpile buys medicines. It makes sense. Why don't we have a Buy American provision for that, for everything, and set a timeline for when we need to bring things back? So that's number one. And then put money behind it. Instead of our taxpayer dollars going to China and other countries, use that money here to create good paying jobs, to make medicines that we need here for our national health security and national security, just to start there, to jumpstart. We all deserve, medicines that are made in trustworthy places. So have those long-term contracts. We have to, what's happened in the marketplace is, you have a company that is doing a great job, and 1 year somebody will come in and undercut them. You have to pay a fair price to the workers, but we can still make it cheaper using technology. So we need the public purchasing, the new technology, long-term contracts, and I want to see, transparency on the cost structure of these companies, transparency on where everything comes from, so we can really say that this is Buy American. And I think you may have alluded to this. So we don't run into another situation like we have now. What we should be stockpiling are active ingredients. That's the most expensive part and complex part to make for medicine. Stockpile those and have plants ready to go. And I've met people, so months ago they were saying, we want to start production of critical drugs that we know are going to be in demand for COVID patients. Have stand-up facilities ready to go, take the API and turn them into finished drugs. You can do that in a matter of weeks, and we would never have to have a shortage of propofol. We'd never have to have a shortage of critical antibiotics. We can do that. But we have to give some, I spoke to the last face mask producer in the United States, and he said the problem we have is feast or famine. So right now it's feast, and years ago with H1N it was feast. But then it goes away, attention goes to something else, and he has to lay off his 100 workers. He was almost in tears thinking, he says, I don't want to do that again. If you're making things, you need a stable, base of customers. At the same time, you have to pay, charge a fair price to the American people. To me, it should be a privilege to make medicines and personal protective gear for doctors and nurses, not an opportunity for taking advantage of a situation. So we have to find some way to be able to stabilize so people can stay in business and people can still have jobs making high-quality products here at home. And Congresswoman Delauro is right. There's going to be another coronavirus. There's going to be something. And 70 countries have banned exports. So we have to have some self-sufficiency. People say, oh, well, it costs too much money. Well, we don't have aircraft carriers made in China. We don't have nuclear submarines made in China. There's some things that we do here. We subsidize farmers. It's an imperfect system, but we realize a country can't function without them.
So let me just advertise something that's coming up about preview of coming attractions in our website, tradewatch.org. We actually took all of those export restrictions and mapped them on time to show basically for all of the fans of the neoliberal system who are saying, heaven forbid, you should try and organize manufacturing in certain countries and have redundancy. And they're all saying the US can't do that because other countries will retaliate. Notably, the US was basically the last country that started thinking about perhaps we should think about where the critical goods we were manufacturing in this country were going. So we're going to have a feature that shows the timeline of how it would be really hard to retaliate against us because everyone had already done it to us beforehand. Apropos of your point about needing some ability to do some production. So one last set of questions, and they're all sort of around the same kinds of issues. So several people have pointed out that Stefan and someone named JR, that it's not so much that we have a China problem, but we have a neoliberal problem. They're asking, is this a China problem or is this just hyper-globalization gone to its worst end where the hysteria about efficiency has resulted in a total lack of reliability and redundancy and supply chains are too stretched? Although there's and then there's a related question, because I have a feeling your answer is going to be not so fast. A related question is when we say, this is from Harriet, when we say China makes drugs, are we saying that Chinese-owned companies make them, or is it US companies producing them in China? And I think the China situation is a special one. That's probably what your book is about, which is unlike the usual greedy race to the bottom globalization, this one has been a collaboration between greedy corporations and a very active Chinese government that's very involved in the economy in China, so that in fact a bunch of them are actually Chinese companies, and in fact they're government-owned enterprises. So can you spell out sort of how this story fits in with the general race to the bottom outsourcing story?
Sure, Lori. I'll take the last question first because it's really interesting. We're seeing, as part of China's 5-year plans, they wanted to have X number of generic pharmaceutical companies with X dollars of revenue by X year. And so we begin with the first generic drug made in China by a Chinese company was in 2007, and that was the HIV/AIDS medicine Nevirapine. And since then, Chinese companies are making antidepressants, birth control pills, medicines for epilepsy, diabetes, Alzheimer's, so many different conditions. And that is going to increase rapidly. And another reason, back to shortages, the ramping up of Chinese domestic companies, again, subsidized by their government, that is a reason why the largest Western generic companies are dropping products. They're no longer making them because they cannot compete. So Mylan is basically gone. Sandoz is a European company. Teva, an Israeli company. These are the biggest generic, 3 Western generic companies, biggest in the world. And they said they were dropping about half their products. They're no longer going to make them. And if you look at the FDA shortage list, you can see it. No longer making. Manufacturer decide to stop production.
So were those companies that were producing some of their stuff in China, but they don't get the subsidy because they're not a Chinese-owned company? Or how
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Remember, China's aim is to become the pharmacy to the world, and that's going to be for its companies, not for Western companies. So I would expect that if China's going to be ramping up quickly, and Western generic drug makers will be gone in 5 years. And I predict in China RX that China will even overtake India over time as the largest generic drug producer, simply because it subsidizes its companies, whereas India does not.
And
so I think yeah. So this is only going to get worse and worse and worse in terms of concentration.
But I think the point you just made is very important and it's one I think some of our listeners are making. The issue here is the Chinese government has this plan that would be similar to what a multinational corporation might have as a plan, as far as, dominating a sector, except you're saying the Chinese government also has a treasury, which is to say it has a very large amount of money to invest in subsidizing the production of national champions. So it's
that's right. And if you and I were going to want to start up, or in China, we're Chinese citizens, and we want to start a plant, the land is free. I mean, you don't buy land. The government has to allocate it, so you don't have the land cost. Your capital expenditures are subsidized, so it's really hard to compete. You're really competing against the Chinese government. You're not competing against Chinese companies.
So it does seem that part of the answer is also the trade remedies that some of the people who've been asking questions, who've been sending in questions, have been talking about taking care of that part as well. I think we could keep this conversation going, but we're running up against time. I don't know if you have a moment or two of comment you want to have as a closing, Rosemary?
No, this is such a robust dialogue. The questions that are coming in are excellent. And I hope that we can continue this because it's so important, particularly as bills are coming up, as we try to take a stab at solving this problem and to bring some of this, not all of it, some of this manufacturing back home. And so we don't have to run into the situation that we have now. And that we can have affordable quality medicines. That should be. I just want to talk about the FDA too, as a regulatory body. I think the FDA we're seeing the beginning of the end of the FDA's capability to function effectively for the protection of consumers in China. Because FDA inspectors are not there now, And it's very hard to be an FDA inspector eventually when you go back to do the job on behalf of the, keeping us safe. That's a whole other issue about regulatory aspects, and another reason maybe to bring it home.
So some of those issues are covered in China RX, Rosemary's book. I want to flag for folks that as the discussion continues, if you sign up to be on the activist list at Rethink Trade, that's rethinktrade.org, you can be updated as these developments happen. We're going to track this new bill about coordinating the medical supply chain and starting to use some of these tools. But as the Congresswoman pointed out, there are a lot of other, and Rosemary just has, there are a lot of other pieces of what it's going to take to actually fix this problem. The one thing I would say is, in a weird kind of maybe pro-people shock doctrine notion, this crisis may have laid bare some truths that were inconvenient to look at when things were going more smoothly. And I have a piece that will be out live on Le Monde Diplomatic's website next week that lays out how maybe, if folks are concerned about these issues, this is a moment unlike any other where we actually can organize to make some of these structural changes in the economy that this crisis has laid bare, that have been percolating along all along, as one of the participants put, where's the oversight and evaluation been for all these years? Well, that's a very good question. And that moment of now us living with the results maybe gives us a different kind of power to try and get a bunch of the stuff fixed. So again, thank you, Rosemary Gibson. Thank you, Congresswoman Rosa Delauro. Everyone who wants to stay up to date on the latest developments on these issues, please again sign up to the Activist Alert page at Rethink Trade. And thank you everybody very much for joining us and all of the excellent questions. Thank you all very much. Our webinar concludes.